When a company sells a product for decades that's later linked to cancer, you might think the next step is to face those lawsuits in court and let juries decide what went wrong.
But with Johnson & Johnson's talc products, we've seen a very different move from inside the playbook, using a Texas corporate law maneuver, sometimes called the Texas two-step, to push talcum powder liabilities into a subsidiary and then into bankruptcy.
I'm Terry Turner, and this is Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drug Watch.
And I'm Whitney Bona, attorney and consumer safety advocate with Drug Watch.
In this episode, we're taking you inside the machine, Big Pharma, profits, and lawsuits.
We're going to explore how drug makers and device companies shape the science, the messaging, and even the legal landscape, often long before most patients ever hear about a new drug.
Johnson & Johnson's talc bankruptcy strategy through the Texas two-step doesn't erase the underlying cancer claims. It tries to corral tens of thousands of ovarian cancer and mesothelioma lawsuits into a bankruptcy proceeding, potentially capping what the company pays and delaying or limiting what individual families learn through discovery and trial.
The Texas two-step didn't work for Johnson & Johnson, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. It was actually thrown out of court 3 times.
And that's not just talc. From Vioxx to opioids to weed killers like Roundup, the legal planning starts early, sometimes years before most of us even know there's a risk.
We'll unpack how these strategies shape what consumers know and what they don't about the products they trust. Last time, we talked about what happens when the system fails and drugs like Vioxx or certain GLP-1s end up at the center of massive lawsuits. But those outcomes don't come out of nowhere.
There's a whole playbook that kicks in long before a drug hits your pharmacy. It includes how trials are designed, how side effects are described, how marketing is framed, and also how legal risk is built into the strategy from the very start.
We started by asking reporters Shannon Brownlee and Jeanne Lenzer how early that planning begins.
Oh God, I have no idea, but I'm sure it's really, really early.
Their spin is so good that they see a lot of flaws and red flags, and they are already spinning them well before they even put it on the market, well before it hits the FDA.
Brownlee and Lenzer have spent decades reporting on the FDA and medical evidence, and in their latest investigation, they built a database of recent drug approvals to see how well companies were meeting the agency's own standards.
Lenzer points to an older bladder pain drug, Almiron, for interstitial cystitis. She uses it as an example of a pattern. In the case they describe, FDA reviewers rejected the drug multiple times because there wasn't good evidence that it worked. Eventually, the company offered a deal. Approve it now on a compassionate use basis, and we'll prove it works later.
That approve now, prove later pattern is exactly what they say has become more common, especially with drugs fast-tracked through special FDA pathways. Instead of insisting on strong proof of benefit first, the agency can rely heavily on post-marketing studies that may or may not deliver.
Here's Jeanne Lenzer.
4 times the FDA said there's no evidence this thing works. And finally, what the company said was, we'll make a deal with you. Put it on the market. We'll prove it works after it's on the market. And the FDA did it. And that's what we're seeing now with so many drugs, that the idea that you're supposed to show that a drug works before you put it on the market and follow it carefully for safety after it's on the market has been completely turned on its head. So now it's put it on the market, we'll figure out whether it works later.
It's a reminder that the story most of us hear at a new drugs launch, press releases, TV coverage, patient stories, is already being shaped to downplay potential red flags and emphasize hope.
So by the time you see an ad in your living room, a lot of decisions about evidence, messaging, and risk have already been made.
The machine doesn't stop with FDA approvals and press releases. Once a drug is on the market, there's a whole ecosystem of forces that determine what gets prescribed and what doesn't.
To understand that, we turn to cardiologist and researcher Dr. Peter Kowey. He's the author of Failure to Treat, a collection of patient stories he's gathered during his career, illustrating what he says are examples of failure in our healthcare system.
We asked him who controls modern medical decision-making: physicians, insurers, pharmaceutical companies, financial intermediaries, or something else?
When I first got interested in going into medicine, it was a direct contact between my parents and our family doctor, and he controlled everything. He didn't even have a nurse or a receptionist. I mean, he did everything himself, gave shots himself. It was really pretty cool. And we have now built an infrastructure which is exponentially different than that, in which there are several different forces that are controlling what we do with our patients. I had this quip with one of my fellows the other day. I said, the diseases are pretty easy to treat. It's the situations that we're in that make life for doctors so complicated.
To recap, Dr. Kowey describes how we've gone from a world where your family doctor stocked medicines in a small office to one where every prescription is filtered through insurance formularies, prior authorizations, and industry-funded guidelines.
I spent a lot of time on trials and supervising them and doing them and whatever. I think that the incidence of flat-out fraud is pretty low. I don't think there's a whole lot of naked fraud in the medical research system, but there's a tremendous amount of bias based on profit motives. The majority of biomedical research in this country is funded by industry, and industry has an axe to grind. So they're going to select projects and programs and candidate drugs that have the potential for profit. And whether that's because they're going to charge a lot of money or because there's a lot of people who have the disease and they believe that they should be able to make money because of the volume of the drug that they can sell. And so they select programs and projects with that bias, not necessarily for the greater good, but certainly for the greater profit. A lot of good things have come out of that.
Dr. Kowey tells us outright fraud in trials is relatively rare, but financial bias is everywhere. Because industry funds a large share of biomedical research, the questions that get asked and the drugs that get developed tend to be ones with strong profit potential, whether that's because prices can be sky high or because the patient population is huge.
Once a drug is being sold and doctors are prescribing it, a different part of the playbook kicks in on how companies respond when whistleblowers or injured patients raise alarms.
We went back to whistleblower advocate Lewis Clark of the Government Accountability Project to ask what that looks like in real life.
Incredibly aggressive. They really do have their legal teams prepared to move forward, and they tend to be rather difficult to deal with. If you're a smallish organization like our own with limited resources, it's daunting industry to challenge.
Clark describes facing deposition rooms packed with corporate lawyers, sometimes dozens on one side of the table, when a small nonprofit or a whistleblower tries to challenge a major drug company. The sheer legal firepower is part of the overall strategy.
Non-disclosure agreements are certainly routine. So they definitely have a practice of once you come to that company and then for the rest of your life, you are really restricted in terms of what you're able to say about the company once you leave. And that's rather routine that you have that issue and that problem. Another thing too, which frequently happens within the company itself, is if someone has raised a concern, there's just a lot of pressure on that person to shut up.
Once a drug is on the market, Clark's experience is that it becomes very hard for the FDA to admit it made a mistake.
If you put all of this together, one question is obvious. Do companies actually plan around the risk they'll be sued?
To answer that, we went back to former pharma insider William Soliman, who's worked in sales and medical affairs and now trains people working in those roles.
He told us the risk of litigation is just one of several financial considerations companies factor into their business.
They do when we are putting out a drug, putting out a promotional piece, a commercial, any materials. It has to go through what we call MLR, medical legal regulatory review. And so there's always a calculation of risk and what potentially the risks are to the company. Remember, this is a very high risk gamble type situation in the pharmaceutical industry. Only a third of the time our drug launch is very successful. So we have to think carefully about how likely is it that we're going to be successful? How likely is it that the payers are going to reimburse us, the insurance company? That's a whole other discussion and argument, but about market access. And then if we're concerned about some type of adverse event, what do we have to anticipate in terms of potential lawsuits and things like that? So of course, I think that gets calculated in.
Soliman says every ad, sales aid, or promotional slide deck goes through that process called medical, legal, and regulatory review. On paper, that's where safety, compliance, and legal exposure are all supposed to be weighed before something reaches doctors or patients.
Soliman has worked for several big pharma companies and was a sales rep for Merck during the Vioxx days. As we explained in the first episode, Vioxx was a prescription pain reliever approved for treating arthritis, but studies later linked it to 88,000 heart attacks, resulting in 38,000 deaths.
After the Vioxx scandal and Merck's $4.85 billion settlement, Soliman says companies became more cautious about burying bad data.
Yes, I think what pharmaceutical companies realized after that is that ultimately they have to be more transparent. So I think transparency with the data became a much bigger issue than it was years ago. And I think companies now, after seeing what happened with Merck, are much more forthright in saying, okay, look, well, this is the data that we found. It's not positive. It's data on file. It's confidential, but we're going to share it and let people know about it. And I think prior to that, they maybe didn't feel as much of an obligation to do that.
But as we heard from Brownlee and Lenzer and from Gates, that doesn't necessarily mean the system is working for patients. It means legal risk is now just another variable inside a sophisticated, profit-driven machine. So, Whitney, from your perspective as an attorney, what stands out to you from what we heard from our guests' insight in this episode?
Yeah, so one thing that stands out is that legal isn't just about what happens after someone gets hurt. It's actually shaping the story from the very beginning. When companies design drug trials or decide how much risk to take or create their marketing messages, they're already thinking about how those choices might look in court years down the road. So the medical, legal, and regulatory review that Soliman described is meant to protect patients, but it can also be used to clean up messaging while still sort of pushing the boundaries of what is profitable. When whistleblowers sign these broad non-disclosure agreements or they're faced with retaliation, it slows down how quickly safety concerns reach the public record or the FDA. So from a consumer safety point of view, this means that litigation does two things. One, it reveals what was happening inside the company through discovery, internal emails, and sworn testimony. And then two, it changes how companies weigh the risks and benefits whenever they're deciding whether to take those similar risks again. That's why, even with all the spin and legal resources on the corporate side, these cases are still so important for accountability.
Thanks for that insight, Whitney. Now, as we'll see in the next episode, the feedback loop goes both ways. Sometimes the threat of lawsuits does more to shape prices, labels, and safety practices than formal regulation ever has.
Next time on Big Pharma Behind the Scenes, we'll look at pills, profit, and pricing, how litigation can act as a shadow regulator when agencies move too slowly or don't have the tools to keep up.
You've been listening to Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drug Watch. If you found this episode helpful, follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can read more about what we're exploring in this series at the link in our podcast description. And visit drugwatch.com for updates on dangerous drugs, medical devices, and ongoing lawsuits.